How to be a great software project manager or product owner for Scrum. I wrote this essay a few years ago, but I think it's still very relevant. It's slightly opinionated, and I do have some strong opinions, but mostly my opinions have not changed since I wrote this essay, so I hope you enjoy it. I think of Scrum and Agile as always a work in progress. That's because different teams can practice it to different levels of strictness. That's okay. The naysayers to Scrum or Agile will call it a top-heavy process, where a quote-unquote certified Scrum Master dictates a strict process from the top down. Sometimes I hear of teams rejecting the ideas of Agile wholesale and on these grounds. For example, we don't need it, or it doesn't work for us. Agile, I have found, is a bit of a buzzword, which fundamentally once meant change as you go or iterate as you go, but now it seems less and less relevant to me. Because so many people use that word so poorly. Scrum is a funny word. It comes from a sports play in rugby, and you can find people playing rugby, of course, in England to this day. I'm not sure exactly what it is about this particular word, Scrum, or this particular software development process, or the lineage between the two, but Scrum as a practice is the practice that resonates most with me as a developer and was what has resonated most with me over the years. It's also the one that I've seen that works the best, and it's the best for teams, particularly for teams. I'm all in support of most of the concepts of Agile, but I think the word has been watered down. As many of my peers in the industry have pointed out to me, lots of people think they are practicing Agile development when in fact they are still plagued by all of the same mismanagement pitfalls of the other options, that is, waterfall and the things that came before it. Scrum is a software development practice that has a lineage to some of the best minds in software development and is a set of practices that work. While Agile has more of a value system involved in it, Scrum is a little bit more focused on the nuts and bolts of the software development life cycle, or SDLC. Scrum also is not a buzzword. Sure, the heart of it is to work in short iterations. That's the heart of it. But I want to list out a few key elements for product managers and product owners, which often get easily missed. This post is aimed at product managers, and in formal Scrum terminology, these are called product owners. If I could highlight one thesis, it would be this. Scrum is about optimizing the operational efficiency of your team. If you're not getting that, and you're not getting that from your Scrum process or your practice of Scrum, then you aren't doing it right. Here are the three most significant anti-patterns or problems that I see on software development teams today. These are like red flags that you are not practicing Scrum correctly. 1, single-queued developers. Don't do this. Developers should focus on one story at a time, period. If you are queuing up a single developer with multiple stories, you're doing it wrong. Each dev should finish their assignment and then come back to the team to take the next highest priority item off the list. Okay, so I know that lots of teams, lots of devs like to work with a back burner story in case you get blocked on your first story. This is very common. I get it, and I concede that for your team or for your dev process, having just one story at a time might not be a realistic absolute. But the principle is that you need to get at the efficiency mechanics of your team, and that the blocker for the dev on the first story that he's blocked on, for example, that leads him to put it on the back burner and take the second story, that represents a cog in your wheel, right? And so in Kanban, we have this concept called pulling the stop chain, right? Where anyone on the assembly line can pull the stop chain and say, wait a minute, there's a cog in the wheel, everything has to stop before moving forward. That's fundamentally how Lean and Kanban leans into this thing about not queuing up developers with more than one story. 2, unclear definition of done. Bad. So I didn't make up definition of done, but I like to emphasize it. Traditionally, definition of done means the definition by which the team considers a story to be done. On teams that I've been on and managed, the concept of definition of done expands to each step of the SDLC, or software development lifecycle, in this order: concept, design, wireframe or spec, and I put those 3 together, execution, QA or UAT, UAT is also known as user acceptance, and finally delivery to production. So that's a very specific order, and I didn't make up that order. I did combine some of the steps there, so your team's process might look a little bit different, but the concept is the same. You work on each little piece until you're done, and then you start again. Wash, rinse, repeat, as they say. However your team does it is fine. Scrum is not about a rigid dictation of process. Scrum is about the concept that each player will hold themselves accountable or be held accountable to getting the ball, or that is the story in software development, to the next step, right? That's why definition of done, DOD, can and should happen at each and every step. The business owner or CEO signs off on the concept. The marketing and design team sign off on the design, right? You, the product manager or product owner, sign off on the wireframe or spec, and with the developer's involvement, that you can actually make sure that they can actually build what you want them to build. The developer writes the code, and the QA person confirms that the feature works, and that you confirm that it is acceptable to the customer, or it will work for the end user. Finally, it is deployed to production, and that's the real done when it's out in the production. But the point is that you do all of those steps, and you do all of them very, very tightly in a quick, tight process, and you get every person to make sure that they agree on what the done step is for them and for that step. And Agile Scrum secret is that Agile in Scrum looks just like Waterfall, but you do the whole 5-step process in short, quick iterations. So, is this too much formal process for you? Okay, that's fine. So then invent an informal process. You can change the rules of Scrum, that's fine. Nobody ever said Scrum dictated a formal process, and whoever said that shouldn't be speaking about it. But if you gotta understand that the process works for a reason. If you're going to make your process more informal, you need to know what the 5 steps are and why they are important, and you have to make sure that in your informal process, each of the steps works and that people are held accountable and hold themselves accountable to each of the definition of done steps. Get everyone to agree to definition of done, including the stakeholders, the designers, and of course, the developers. Sometimes a designer or stakeholder might say something like, nothing's ever done, or everything's a moving target. Maybe you've heard that before in startup worlds. Maybe it feels that way to you on your team, and I can sympathize with that. But if the stakeholder or designer doesn't want a clear sign-off or thumbs up or it's ready now, step, if they want to be, what I'm saying here is, if they want to be sort of nebulous about their part of the step and say, oh, well, it's always very moving and it's always very shifting, that's a sign that they haven't bought into the definition of done. And that's a red flag. So go back to the beginning and start again. Now, about definition of done, it's rare that you have to deal with a developer who does not want to have a clear definition of done on the team. The good developers I've worked with are all goal and completion oriented by our nature. Sometimes junior developers can drag their feet, let projects slip, and not finish things. As the product owner, disciplining this kind of developer is not actually your responsibility. But be on the lookout for it and understand that the definition of done applies to across the whole pipeline at each and every step, right? So that's where these 2 steps, both the design phase and the acceptance phase, both of which you really can and should be involved in. These 2 steps are so important, that what goes in and what comes out. to the development process. Definition of done is such an important thing to Scrum. Really, I didn't make it up. Look it up, it's a thing. Lack of discipline around done is the single most significant team anti-pattern that I see. 3, developers complain about lack of prioritization. Bad. Okay, so this is very common thing. This is a very common thing that I see on many software teams. You have lots and lots of ideas and you have lots of stories that are written down in your tracking system. New stories, new ideas come up all the time. You have meetings and stand up and developers say, I'm looking at a list of unprioritized stories. If developers say this in your meetings, especially if they say it a lot, then you have a problem. It is the product owner or product manager's job to represent the business interests or the customer's interests in prioritizing the work log, or in formal Scrum known as a backlog. This is really, really important. Yes, developers do lots of things related to prioritization of code and code debt that you may or may not fully understand, you as the product owner. And yes, sometimes developers can be very welcoming to reprioritization, and sometimes we can be very unwelcoming to reprioritization. So that's software development. That's just how it goes. If you want to work with the best dev teams, these are the kinds of nuances that you have to navigate to be a successful product manager. Some other tips, 4 through 10. These are not anti-patterns. These are just sort of observations. Some of them are things that people do that are not right. Some of them are just good advice for product owners. 6 more tips for product managers. Keep in mind that these are written from a developer, that's me, to a product manager, the perspective of a developer to a product manager, so take them with a grain of salt. These are opinionated and based on my several years of working on Scrum teams. 4, don't skip user stories. This one seems obvious, but I'm amazed at how many product people are so quick to skip formal user stories. They're so easy. I'm pretty formal about them, and I prefer this style. As a, when I, and I should. Now, there are a few variations on this style, and any of them is okay. The most common one is as a, so that I can, I should. And we do this, we state who the person is that's going to be taking the action, so that I can is written out in the user story so that we think about why the person is taking this action, and I should is the assertion. Learn how to write user stories and use them. In strict Scrum, you only have one user story per ticket or story in your backlog. However, I don't follow that. I like to have a ticket or a story in a backlog and have maybe 4 or 5, not too much many more, but 4 or 5 user stories in this one ticket that describe a cluster of user stories that all go together around the feature that I'm building. So story A might be, as a user, when I type in the right username and password and click login, I should be successfully logged in. Story B, which will be in the same exact ticket for me, for example, might be, as a user, when I type the wrong username and password and click login, I should see a message telling me my username and password are incorrect. For repetition in your user stories is fine. For the code, we like to not repeat ourselves. But in user stories, it's fine to do a little bit of repetition. In fact, for QA people, repetition is fine. By writing out the stories up front, you're setting up the QA for success. Don't skip user stories, please. Write them, get your stakeholders or your CEOs to buy in on writing user stories, and believe in them. They work. Forcing yourself, the product owner, to go through this discipline forces you to methodically put yourself in the end user or the customer's perspective. And it forces out all of the little extra edge cases which need to be explicitly dealt with by the programmers. That's why we write user stories. This kind of explicitness is nearly universally welcomed by developers, and the more work up front in this area typically makes the development faster and more efficient. 5, don't skip wireframes. It's amazing to me how many product people just try to have meetings with developers. Talking, lots of talking. I know some people are better at visual communication or auditory communication, but your job as the product owner is to document those meetings. Like user stories, wireframes drive the conversation about the software development itself, which is most of the work. It's the thing that you didn't think of when you just had the verbal conversation, or that thing that you didn't think of when someone else, when you explained it to somebody else after having received the information from a third party. So it's when you put pen to paper and you literally or metaphorically create a wireframe that you begin to understand some of the needs around the users and around the software. Getting all those little tidbits out up front, you are reducing the waste in the software development process and speeding up the process for developers. 6, do QA yourself. The best product people do QA themselves, even if there's a separate QA specialist on the team. Yes, product and QA are distinct skill sets. Yes, on some small teams, they are the same person. But don't be one of those product people who eschews doing QA yourself. If you're not the best at it, learn to get better at it and QA the projects that you are managing. It'll be better for the team and it'll make you a better product manager. 7, get stakeholder or executive or exec, as you commonly hear in startups, buy-in early and before the devs write a line of code. Really, don't skip this step. This is your primary job. If you're going back to the dev for revision after revision after revision because the CEO keeps changing his mind, then you aren't doing your job right. 8, think like a dev, but don't think like a dev. This one is very tricky. And I know this one is very hard. You need to know some things about what you think is possible with the technology that you have and separate that from the technology that you could have or that you dream that you want. Understand that there's a constant in software development, there's a constant pay it now or pay it later kind of tension while we're writing the code. So that's why you need to have just enough technical acumen, but don't step on devs' toes because it comes off really bad. 9, ask for what you need. Don't be afraid to ask the devs, but try to do so politely and without making any assumptions that you know anything. Just report the facts and ask for what you need and offer any helpful information. And finally, 10, don't ever say, but it worked before, or but it used to work, or anything sounding like that. This is never something a developer wants to hear. If you're in a position of software development management, don't lean on this trope. Yes, developers are responsible, we developers are responsible for our regressions that happen on our code deploys, sure. Sometimes when a developer deploys some code, it introduces a regression, it's entirely possible. But 95% of the time I hear product managers say, used to work before, it's from non-technical people say it used to work before, it is typically not something that has anything to do with the developer. I happen to think it's a very unfortunate trope that is used by non-technical people who fundamentally do not understand a concept in software development called software entropy. And software entropy is the idea that a software actually just naturally breaks down over time. It's a slightly funny concept because the code doesn't change, but the reality is over time so many things could break down and so many things could go wrong that the software is naturally going to get degraded over time. If you really think that it just used to work before the deploy, it's okay to report that in an evidence-based way when you report the bug to the developer. As in, the last successful time that I saw it work was before the deploy, or this may or may not be related information. So that's totally fine to do that. But what we don't want as developers is what we do want as developers for you to give us as much information as possible. So last successful one was deployed before the deploy. What we don't want is for you to come at us in an accusatory way. So you need to do it in a nice, evidence-based fashion. Use your words, use your screenshots, throw in may or may not be related. It'll work like magic, I promise. Some really passive-aggressive version of the negative side of this that I've seen is to not tell the developer the key piece of information that the product manager has that's related to the regression, thinking that they'll test or challenge them to find the bug. This too is not cool, so don't do this. So as a non-technical person, let me tell you something that the developers that you work with really want to scream at you. You understand a fraction of what's going on under the hood in the application that you're working on. You already knew this. I didn't really need to tell you this, and the developers don't need to tell you this either. Leaning on the "it used to work" trope constantly is an accusatory sign of an amateur manager who just doesn't get it. If you find yourself doing this, you should put yourself in check and ask yourself if this is the right career for you. Conclusion. Being a great product manager, like all things in life, takes compassion. A great boss and mentor of mine told me once that, and I think this was very smart of him, the product owner is the most leveraged individual on a Scrum team. That was the word he used, leveraged. And that is, if you're on a company and you're not on the product team, that is like you're a stakeholder, to get what you want out of the engineers, you should make really good friends with the product owner, right? Because being friends with that person will allow you to exercise that leverage over the engineering team. You have great road ahead of you, product manager, if you should heed the discipline's core principles of Scrum. If you fight them, then you might have a rocky time, especially in the areas of code debt, incorrect estimation, missed deliverables, and mismatches between what the developers are doing and what the client or company needs. And nobody wants that. So wherever you're at today is fine, but think about the discipline's various approaches and think about how to take each piece of your process one small step in the direction of Scrum. You might waver, you might run into various problems, but each of them can be solved by coming back to the discipline's core values at each step in the chain, always bringing your team closer and closer to making it the most efficient state that it can be. This is why I call Scrum always a work in progress. Teams typically don't get it right away at first and have to do inefficient ways before they can move towards Scrum to practice more efficient ways.